Hey, how y'all doing? This is Mongo Slade, and today we're going to talk about the three blind men and an elephant. But first, hit me with a like. Also, hit me with a subscribe. And thank you guys for liking and subscribing. So, the three blind men and an elephant is a parable about subjective reality. So, the story goes that three blind men are feeling an elephant, and each one of them has their own idea of what an elephant is. One of them feels the trunk, says that it's a snake. One feels the body, feels and believes that the elephant is a tree. One feels the tail and feels the elephant is really a rope or a tree branch. Each one not really knowing that the elephant is an elephant, but generally each one of them experiences at least one piece of the elephant as something that is familiar to them. So, how do I put that into a wrestling context? I want to talk about the three blind men of wrestling: the professional fan, or otherwise known as the smark, the editor, the person who talks about storytelling and writing, and the old timer. So to represent these people, I'm going to pick the three biggest critics of WWE. Let's talk about it as these three guys. So to represent the super fan, the mark, the editor, the super fan, the professional fan, let's say, the smart, we're gonna have actually going to have Dave Meltzer. For the to represent the editor or those who critique WWE's writing, we're going to use Vince Russo. And to talk about how WWE approaches the wrestling business, obviously no better option to use than Jim Cornette. So we're going to go through what their general ideas are, what things they get right, meaning the parts of the elephant that they can touch and recognize, and what things do they get wrong. Why do they cease to see the full elephant? So the first thing, let's talk about what they get right. Well, let's talk about their main ideas. So Dave Meltzer talks a lot about booking, match quality. He rates matches. That's what he does. So most of his stuff when it comes to fans is about who's wrestling who, where they are on the card, how much time do they get, that kind of thing. So you have Vince Russo. You talk about the storytelling. Is what the character is saying, does it make sense? Is it a building off the previous week? Is it building to something either later in the show or next week? That kind of thing. And with Jim Cornette does it follow tradition? Does it something that follows under the guise of wrestling as a conceptual idea and as it has always been traditionally? Now, if you've been following my channel for a long time, I made a video several months ago called "The Lexus and the Olive Tree," where basically I talked about Dave Meltzer and Jim Cornette and how they represent two versions of the world. Where Jim Cornette represents the olive tree, which is tradition, and Dave Meltzer represents the Lexus, which is the future or the materialistic now. And I'm just adding Vince Russo to this, essentially. But it's also a very different concept. So there's, of these three, when they critique WWE specifically, they usually get certain things correct. One thing that Meltzer seems to get is that they knew WWE does need to let their wrestlers push more barriers, take more risks, especially in the ring, work a faster style, be willing to accept that the guys might get injured, guys might get hurt, and you take the shackles off the talent. Some of the things about, over script and promos, these are sort of things that, Meltzer talks a lot about, and he kind of has a point. Now, what does Vince Russo say that might be a good point? So Vince Russo talks about cohesion, building a story, building a narrative throughout the show, setting an event that builds throughout the show. If you go back to how Vince Russo used to write shows, he would start something at the beginning of the show and it would continue throughout the show. And that makes sense. He also says something that's very important that a lot of people have ripped him apart for, and that is that you need to keep matches short. But what I did is I just gave him the benefit of the doubt and I said, keep cold matches short. So matches that don't have any heat, where there's no storyline between the two opponents, those matches could be 6 minutes or less. Okay? And I think that if you have that mentality, you can understand why Vince Russo is correct. And Jim Cornette is pretty simple. Um, Commitment to basic principles, the commitment of the basic principles of pro wrestling, baby faces and heels, basic psychology, do things make sense? Where are you going in the grand scheme of things? So those are the things that they get right. So what are things that they get wrong? Well, for instance, Meltzer is a work rate guy. So he seems to think that great matches are enough. But a matter of fact, great matches are not enough. In fact, quite often, work rate matches are boring to the average viewer. Most people don't want to sit and watch people work for 15 minutes, especially if the match is cold. There are more interesting things in wrestling than TV ratings. There's certainly more important things than that. The sizzle is just as important as the steak. So the personality of the performer is just as important as whether they can work or not. In fact, in some cases, it's more important that the performer has a personality. So for Russo, he needs to recognize that matches actually do matter. People watch wrestling to see wrestling. That cultural tastes have changed a lot from when he used to write TV. So you talk about a guy who used to watch a lot of Crash TV, a lot of Jerry Springer, Howard Stern, South Park, all that type of stuff. Most of that type of stuff would not fly today. The excessive blood and violence that he was into, the excessive sex stuff that he was doing, especially when he was doing it in the Attitude Era, and he was doing it in TNA, so it's a regular Russo thing. It does not work today. The chaotic content that he was writing simply does not work today. The 90s style of writing and the 90s culture and in the early 2000s culture that he was used to is sort of dead today. Now, for Jim Cornette, it's a little bit different. For Jim Cornette, his ideas are great for small town audiences. He loves folk heroes, your Tracy Smothers and your Bullet Bob Armstrongs. These guys who might be able to get over in small rural areas, maybe even small towns, but the big cities where the money is really made, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, they don't really rate these guys, and it's unfortunate, but it's true. You know, his vision of wrestling is not inclusive enough. And I hate to use that word because it's been bastardized to such a degree, but it is not inclusive enough to be a national wrestling audience. Also, the 80s style of booking, of building a show to a big crescendo, 15,000 people, and the match ends with a count out. The match ends with a disqualification because some guy ran into the ring and stomped, silly stuff like, oh, Kevin Von Erich defeated Ric Flair for the World Heavyweight Championship. Oh, wait, the referee just woke up and reminded everybody that Kevin threw Ric Flair over the top rope 2-3 minutes ago. So we're going to reverse the decision. No, we can't do that today. It's just not going to work. That kind of thing would turn people off if you were to do that today. That kind of thing, simply put, it does not work. Not in today's modern world. So we also have to look at these things as, obviously these things kind of contradict each other. And there's good reason for it. Dave Meltzer has never written a wrestling show. He's never run a wrestling promotion of any kind. So his conceptualization of what wrestling is basically speaking for the fan, and then also speaks for a small section of the fandom, because most people who are wrestling fans have no idea who Dave Meltzer is. Vince Russo does know what makes compelling TV, but he doesn't really know what makes compelling TV in today's modern world. He knows what makes compelling TV in an age where TV was a big deal as far as following an MTV style audience. Sure, it may work for them, but that stuff is really alienating to a lot of young people today. Again, the culture has changed. Russo's success was largely cultural. He was able to tap into the vein of larger popular culture. Was again the South Park sort of Family Guy style of wrestling that we was going through in the 90s, where nothing mattered. You can have guys throwing fireballs and doing all the kind of crazy stuff. That some of that stuff can work today, but most of the bikini stuff that he was doing and all that stuff would never fly today. People would be up his ass with a broomstick if he was to try to do that stuff today. And Jim Cornette, obviously, this is the guy who has the most of the experience. He has run wrestling promotions, but he's never run a wrestling promotion the size of WWE. With as many masters as it takes to operate the WWE. He's never had to deal with TV promotions to the degree that Vince McMahon does. You talk about somebody who used to record his show, and his show was always syndicated. So he used to dealing with TV promotions as far as, making a deal to air his show. So that means he tapes a show and then he sends it all over the country, and then his partners upload the episode. He's never had to deal with, these big money promotion, these big money TV networks who obviously want a hand in who's the budget for the production and what talent is on top, and all that. So he's never had to deal with that. So it seems like Vince McMahon is the only person who knows that the elephant is an elephant, because he's the only one who can possibly see the whole thing. So it's really, when you say that, when people criticize him, it's like, okay, everybody criticizes him from their own subjective point of view, where they say, and they may have a point, that sometimes there are no stories that weave throughout the show. Sometimes he does veer too far off of tradition. Sometimes he does have the shackles too tight on the promoters. But these people who have never had to be put in that situation don't know why those things are there. Like, it's impossible for you to know why WWE is a PG product. And you're like, well, why doesn't it just stop being PG? That should be easy. It's like, well, no, they have all these sponsorships, and then maybe there's something about the sponsorships and the different corporate partnerships that they have that makes it worth doing over trying to be TV 14, which is what probably, Vince Russo would probably want. To have all of those, to have the blood, the sex, the violence, to be able to do outrageous and outlandish things. And, and you can't really do traditional pro wrestling, because if it turns off a lot of people, then you got to look at these people who giving you $200 million or something like that, and responding to them and telling them, hey, your small town folk hero champion is not drawn in Chicago, is not drawn in New York. What are you going to do? You're going to have to get rid of that guy. And, it's obviously it's going to have to be something that's going to be appealing to the average viewer, and and I wouldn't say Meltzer speaks to the average viewer. I think he speaks to what we call, the 1% of the wrestling audience, maybe 2%, but certainly not even half or even 60%, or not even 40 or 30 or 10%. I think most of the wrestling audience does not know Dave Meltzer from a can of paint, but each one of these guys individually has a good point. So if you listen to them, and you can usually just take other people who exist out there in the universe, and just listen to them, and you can usually put them in one of these categories. For instance, Disco Inferno. Obviously he goes into the whole Vince Russo pile, because not only because they work together, but if you listen to Disco, he talks a lot about the writing of the show, because he was somebody who was interested in the writing of the show. And, you have your super fans, your JD from New York, your Solid Monsters, all those guys. They pretty much just go with Meltzer anyway. And then you have your Jim Ross, your, to some degrees, other people who may have podcasts, Dutch Mantel or Raven or somebody like that. They're more in the Cornette camp, because they are people who've done it before. They are creative-minded people. They've been in the business a long time. They see the violations of tradition, and they can speak out about it. They can say, hey, this wouldn't have flown when I in the territory days. This wouldn't have flown in the early 90s, but it's a completely different world now. And so those are kind of how the critics work. And sometimes I've dabbled in all of it. I'm far more of a Russo than a Cornette. I'm actually willing to forgive a lot of the breaking of tradition if it makes sense within the context of the story that you're telling. Because I do understand that the TV has changed, and what some people view as a good guy is not really good guy stuff. Like I said, I've been fighting it. Like when you look at TV shows, like I told people before, I used to hate the TV show Son of Anarchy, because they try to tell me that the drug running gang members who murdered people were good guys. It's not the case. But sometimes you have to suspend your disbelief. You have to suspend your morality in order to enjoy a show. Like what was that show that used to come on Stars? What was it? Power, where the good guy, the supposed good guy, was like a murdering drug dealer who was cheating on his wife and all that type of stuff. Left his kids to run off with his childhood crush who was a Fed and all that type of stuff. Like, that stuff was disgusting to me, but it was entertaining to a bunch of other people. It violated traditions. So if you think about the world in a different way, then it should be fully understood that people are going to be looking at things from different perspectives. They're going to approach things from a different perspective. But ultimately, you all can see the whole if you work together. All right. All right. So that's it. So thank you guys for listening. Like this video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll talk to you guys later.